Infrastructure projects and operating assets are frequently impacted by regulatory uncertainties and changes. This study evaluated existing methods to proactively identify, anticipate, and mitigate the impacts of constantly changing regulatory requirements. In this presentation, you will learn how companies can better prepare to adapt and respond to regulations throughout the capital asset lifecycle. Here to present their findings, please welcome Ali Mostafavi, Carzell Walton, Laura Brannen, and Ryan Stoa.
Very good. Thank you. We are here to talk about regulations. Yay! I have been working on regulatory policy for most of my career, and I can tell you that's not usually the response I get when I say I'm here to talk about a new regulation. Usually I get some combination of moaning and groaning, banging your head against the wall, because regulations can be really frustrating and incredibly disruptive if they come at the wrong point in your capital project. Let me tell you a little story. So a few years ago, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, hopefully we all know OSHA, updated their standards for walking working surfaces. These are the standards that govern handrails, harnesses, other protective measures to keep people safe when they're working at heights. And one of the companies that our research team talked to during the research phase was in the middle of building a very large energy facility when the rules came into effect. Because of the way the compliance period was set up and the way the compliance requirements were set up, they ended up having to refabricate many of the stairwells and catwalks that hadn't yet been installed, and then manually adjusting the handrail heights for those that had. You can imagine this was incredibly disruptive to the schedule and represented a pretty significant cost. And I'm sure if we talked to all of you in the room today, you'd have some pretty similar experiences. So let's see a show of hands of anyone who's had this kind of experience where a regulatory change came somewhere in the middle of your project and it represented a big engineering or design change. Yeah, if you could keep your hands up for a minute, thank you. So let me ask another question. How many of you had this experience? Have you, a new regulation was released and it created the need for a new project, so a new investment or a new change to a facility? Yep, also a lot of hands. For those of you who raised your hands, how many of you felt like you had enough time and enough information to seamlessly integrate that change into your project? No one. The results of our research based on the results of our research, the number of hands that are not up right now is not surprising. There seems to be a sense of frustration amongst the industry that regulatory changes are very difficult to deal with and very difficult to integrate seamlessly into your capital planning projects and project execution plans. So that's what our research team was tasked with looking at. How do we better anticipate and identify the regulatory changes that are coming down the pike and then integrate those into the capital project process to minimize disruptions and costs? And so to do that, we kind of started with the basic fundamental challenge. On one hand, you have the regulatory life cycle. You have your regulators off, protecting the environment, making sure people are safe, making sure everybody's playing fairly by the rules. On the other hand, you have all of you wonderful people in this room building really cool projects. And those life cycles, or those two cycles, rarely match up perfectly. And that's where the opportunity or the potential for disruption comes from, the fact that you have these two cycles that don't necessarily match up. And so our research team tried to take a look at how do you get those two How do you identify what's coming out of the regulatory life cycle and incorporate that into the project life cycle? So today we're going to share with you some of the highlights of our findings, some of the solutions that we came up with. Carzell and I will give you a little bit of background on the impacts of regulations and how we did our research. And then Ali and Ryan will take you through some of those solutions. But there's one thing I'd like you to keep in mind as we go through this presentation. We all have a role to play. No matter if you spend most of your time dealing with the regulatory life cycle or most of your time during your day-to-day life dealing with the project life cycle, it takes a lot of integration and communication to bring those two together. And so it's beholden on all of us to understand where those links occur and to understand what our role is in both pulling out the right information from our colleagues and pushing out the information that we all need to make the right decisions, to deal with the uncertainty, and to manage the risks.
Has over 180,000 pages of rules. The last 3 administrations issued anywhere from 350 to 500 new rules. These rules were the ones that are made with the standard rulemaking process and that are over $100 million of economic impact. This does not account for things like a new regulator coming into the job and having a different interpretation of what the regulation is. It doesn't account for things like an environmental or regulatory signal that tells you that something different is going to be done with the way the rules are applied. It also doesn't account for an executive order, nor does it account for a new guidance document or any other number of things that could change the way a regulation is applied. So keeping up with all these regulations or the changes of regulations can be pretty tough, and it can create a lot of uncertainty and risk depending on where your project is in the life cycle. Okay, so over the last 2 years, our group has scoured the industry to try to figure out what are the challenges and what works and what doesn't work. We cast a wide net by doing a literature review as well as a survey of companies. In doing all of that, we didn't stop there, we dove deeper. We dove deeper by looking at what were the company's experiences and practices with specific regulations. We spoke with over 80 subject matter experts with over 800 years of experience on how to deal with and manage regulatory change. We didn't stop there. We tested these findings with a group of knowledgeable subject matter experts. One important finding that will underpin everything else that we'll talk to you today about in this presentation is this. The earlier you start to identify and adapt to regulatory changes, the greater your ability to minimize risk and capitalize on opportunities. You have to be proactive to bring value to your projects. Let me explain. As the regulatory process unfolds, the degree of certainty of the final rule increases. However, your ability to influence that regulation decreases. Now, when the regulatory cycle and the project life cycle align, companies and leaders can confidently commit resources to address the requirements of the rule. But we know that those cycles rarely align. More often than not, you'll have a cycle, or you'll have a project, and there's a pending regulation out there that could impact that project. And so decision makers have to steer through a lot of uncertainty and risk. So the earlier you start, you gain a few things. First of all, when you start early, you gain the ability to help influence the outcome of the final rule. You also gain actionable intelligence to help make better decisions. You minimize the spending of extra money, and you minimize disruptions. Now, saying to be more proactive is a lot different than knowing how to actually be more proactive. And that is where our research comes in. Laura.
So we applied a concept called future-proofing to this regulatory challenge. And future-proofing is simply anticipating the distant future and taking proactive actions to minimize risks, maximize opportunities for value realization. So there's a lot of things to unpack there. First of all, it's the distant future. It's not tomorrow, it's not next week, even the next year. It's 3 to 5 years in the future. What's coming down the pike? And then it's taking proactive actions, the benefits that Carzell talked about, to minimize the risks and maximize the opportunities. And it's that proactive action and those getting a handle on those risks and opportunities is where you get the value creation. So we combined the concept of future-proofing and all of the experiences that we gathered through all of the surveys and case studies and field studies and put together a guide for regulatory future-proofing. The guide has 3 basic components. First, we charted on one piece of paper all of the steps that it takes to anticipate and adapt to regulatory change. Again, this has never been put down on a single piece of paper. There were kind of bits and pieces everywhere, but we collated and put it all together in one place. And the benefit of doing that is it then allows all of you to look at the practices that you already have in place in your organization and understand kind of what pieces maybe you're missing or where you fit in that regulatory or in that future-proofing process. But just knowing the steps isn't enough. You need to know how to do them effectively. And so we, for each of the steps of the process or for each of the sub-processes, we put together a set of key actions that outline how to carry out those sub-processes effectively and get the best results. But then we gained altitude again and looked at the entire regulatory future-proofing process. And what does it take? What are the common themes that we saw cropping up across all of the different sub-processes? And what does it take to implement the process in its entirety? And so the guide also has a section for good practices for implementation. We're going to hit all 3 of these pieces today. So there's going to be a lot of information, and it may be a little disorienting at first. And so to help us help you get through, figure out kind of what pieces may be most pertinent to you, we're going to rely on a few friends here. So first we have Maria. Maria is a new project manager. She's managing her first big project. She knows that regulations and regulatory changes are on her risk register, but she's not quite entirely sure what resources are available within her company to help her manage and mitigate those risks.
Then we have Kareem. Kareem has worked in the environmental health and safety group in the corporate level and the project level for over the last decade. He and his team are always active in trying to figure out what can we do to improve, what can we do to handle regulations better.
Then there's Patty. Patty is the senior-most project executive in her company, and from her perch, she has a sense that her company could be doing this better, that they're kind of stuck in reactionary mode. And what she wants is a clearer sense of what's ahead, so that she has the ability to make better decisions.
And finally, there's Joe. Joe is a business development manager of a large EPC firm. Now, it's important for Joe to know what drives his customers' decisions. And he believes that regulations and regulatory changes drive the decisions. But he knows that it's hard to keep up with regulations and he doesn't really have the time to keep up with the regulations. So when we think about Maria, Kareem, Patty, and Joe, they all have different roles and responsibilities, and they work for very different companies. So what we plan to do is, as we dive through and dive deeper into the presentation, we're going to show how our findings fit the day-to-day lives of our characters here, and hopefully you too will be able to see how your day-to-day work activities can integrate with our findings. So with that said, we'll turn it over to Ali and Ryan.
We are very excited to introduce our future-proofing process map, which is the backbone of our regulatory future-proofing guide. Please don't try to read the process map. This is not an eye test. Our goal today is to provide an overview of this process map, break it down to its component, so that hopefully by the end of this presentation, we generate enough excitement in you so that after the end of the presentation, you go to this CII app, the knowledge base, download our guide, and then start navigating our process map yourself. The process map has two dimensions. The x-axis at the top presents the stages of regulatory development, all the way from the pre-rule stage to the compliance period. We have color-coded different stages of regulatory development so that you can identify what needs to be done at different stages of regulatory development. The y-axis of the process map shows different sub-processes of regulatory adaptation. We have represented each sub-process as a swim lane, and each swim lane includes key actions, decision points, and steps that needs to be done to ensure that that sub-process leads to effective outcomes. And also, using arrows, we show the relationship between different actions across different swim lanes. As you can see, using these two-dimensional space, the process map provides powerful visual information for regulatory future-proofing as an integrated process. While this future-proofing process is a company-level element, there is close interaction with the project development process, as we will explain throughout our presentation. If you are an executive in your company or a manager, you can use this process map to identify how regulatory future-proofing is done currently in your organizations and where you need better integration across different sub-processes. If your role is in a specific functions like project management or engineering or environmental or government affairs, you can use the process map to locate where your function plays a role and how you would interact with other functions. In the following slides, we break this process map to its component and talk about key actions related to each sub-process. So let's start with the stages of the regulatory development, and Ryan walk us through that.
Thanks, Ali. As Ali mentioned, the process map is complex, which reflects the reality that the regulatory landscape is itself complex. So we're going to spend the next few slides breaking down that process map across its two dimensions. And the first one is the temporal development or the regulatory development stages. There are many ways that an agency can bring about a regulatory change. For our purposes today, we're going to use informal rulemaking or notice and comment rulemaking, which is the most common type of regulatory change process to illustrate the process map. And there are 5 stages to that change. The first stage is pre-rulemaking. Here, an agency is identifying a problem out in society, determining if they have jurisdiction to address that problem, and then finally, if they have the resources or the inclination to do something about that problem. If they decide to move forward, we enter into stage 2. In proposed rule development, the agency starts drafting the rule that they might eventually put out to the public, which culminates in publication of that proposed rule. In stage 3, we have a commenting period. Here, typically 30, 60, or 90 days, the public has an opportunity, regulated entities and trade associations have an opportunity to comment on the proposed rule, to perhaps make some modifications to its final form. And in stage 4, the agency takes those comments, they take that feedback, they make some tweaks to the rule, and finalize with a final rule publication. The process doesn't end there, though. We continue into the compliance period. The agency is ensuring that regulated entities are in compliance with the new rule and sometimes continuing to make changes by issuing things like policy statements or interpretive orders. What I want you to notice about these regulatory development stages is the relationship between certainty and influence. Early on in the change process, there is a high degree of uncertainty. We are not sure if the agency is going to act, or if they do decide to act, in what form the final rule will take. On the other hand, there is a high potential for influence. Regulated entities, organizations that are in touch with regulators and engaging with their stakeholders have an opportunity here to direct the future trajectory of that regulation. Later on in the process, there is low uncertainty, of course. The final rule has been published. We know what it's going to look like. There may only be changes at the margins at this point. And there is very little influence that can be done at this point. I want to also talk about some examples of how these stages can take place, and in particular, the variability between different regulations. Our research team conducted 3 case studies of regulatory changes that have been highly disruptive over the last several years. The first was OSHA's respirable crystalline silica standard. This regulation attempted to address silica and the health effects of silica on construction sites. The second was the mercury and air toxics standard promulgated by the Environmental Protection Agency, addressing air toxics. And the final was the EPA's Clean Power Plan, and many of you may have heard of, attempting to address carbon emissions from power plants. What I want you to notice about this slide is the difference that each regulation took in each stage of regulatory development. Notice, for example, OSHA's crystalline silica standard spent 15 years in its proposed rule development stage, and each regulation may take its own path towards its final form. I'm now going to talk about the sub-processes, the action items of the process map. Our first sub-process is stakeholder engagement. These are the formal or informal interactions that you might have with other companies, business units within your company, trade associations, and other stakeholders that can influence the regulatory process. Regulatory horizon scanning, a formal, systematic examination of future threats and opportunities that might be coming down the pipeline as a result of a regulatory change. Risk and opportunity assessment. Here we need to understand the impacts to a business, assets, and capital projects as a result of what we have learned through our horizon scanning process. Having understood the risks and opportunities, it's critical to develop a response strategy. It's an adaptive process to identify the actions, the solutions, the technologies that will ensure compliance, finalizing with the implementation of that compliance and of that response strategy development. Now, it's important to recognize that these sub-processes are interrelated and they are not linear. Our process map attempts to visualize how these processes interact with the regulatory development stages. And in the next several slides, Ollie and I are going to go through each of these sub-processes, providing key actions and key decision points for each sub-process in the process map. We'll start with stakeholder engagement. It's essential in engaging stakeholders to engage not just a few, but all stakeholders, and to engage them at the right time. Early on in the development process, this might mean being in touch with regulators to know what might be coming down the pipeline. During the commenting period, perhaps you're touching base with trade associations to determine how the industry is going to react. Another critical point we found is to provide data-driven evidence to your stakeholders. Regulators understand that anytime they put out a new regulation, there will be winners and there will be losers. Simply stating that you don't like a regulation is not very compelling. But providing data-driven evidence that there is another solution, another approach that can achieve the regulatory objective can be very compelling. One example we found from our case study of the mercury and air toxic standards One company gathered data by pilot testing their technologies early, communicated that to their stakeholders, and that informed the evaluation of their response strategies. If you're Kareem, our EH&S manager, Kareem needs support in order to pilot test some of these solutions that can then be used for their data-driven evidence. Our next sub-process is regulatory horizon scanning. Again, this is the process of identifying those future threats and opportunities coming down the pipeline. It's important here to allocate resources and to right-size those resources. There's a large amount of information coming out of the regulatory landscape, and much of that information needs to be tracked, including its various trends. An effective regulatory horizon scanning infrastructure can be very powerful. One example we found from our Clean Power Plan case study, one company allocated dedicated staff to track regulatory changes and anticipate the impacts of the Clean Power Plan. They considered that investment in horizon scanning to be a competitive advantage and found that there was an organizational strength. In order to pull this off, Patty, our executive, needs to make the decision to invest in a robust regulatory horizon scanning team.
The next sub-process is risk and opportunity assessment. Actually, this sub-process is the engine of future-proofing. Why? Because it pulls information from other sub-processes and also triggers action in other sub-processes. Therefore, there is a need for different levels of risk analysis at different stages of regulatory development process. Our research identified 4 levels of risk analysis that should be implemented at different stages. The first 2 levels of risk analysis, level 1 and level 2, are conducted at the earliest stages of regulatory development, where there is little information available about a proposed rule and significant uncertainty exists. The goal of these 2 levels of risk analysis is to evaluate whether a proposed regulatory change has an impact on companies' projects and assets. This analysis is conducted at the company level and could be part of the enterprise risk management process, or could be part of the integrated resource planning, or IRP, for power companies. The outcome of the analysis at this level informs the level of effort needed for horizon scanning and also stakeholder engagement. And also for level 2 risk analysis, the outcome triggers the need for developing a response strategy. The next 2 levels of risk analysis, level 3 and level 4, are conducted later on after the proposal is announced and there is more information about the proposed rule, but still there is considerable uncertainty. The focus of risk analysis at these 2 stages is to first evaluate whether the response strategy that is being developed is robust to minimize non-compliance risk, and then evaluate its effective implementation and ensuring that enough redundancy and contingencies are placed in different projects to minimize the non-compliance risk. Understanding these 4 levels of risk analysis is important for different roles and different functions. For example, our project manager, Maria, needs to understand who does level 1 and level 2 risk analysis in her company. Get engaged in those analyses, provide input and her thoughts on how her projects would be impacted by the pending regulation. And also gather information about the expected impacts and other activities at the company level, and build that into her project risk register, and also project contingency plan to minimize the risk. These 4 levels of risk analysis will ensure the development of a robust response strategy, which is our next sub-process. A response strategy development is an iterative process to ensure timely actions at different stages of regulatory development process to minimize the impacts and disruptions on projects. Our research identified that the need for implementing response strategy development should be identified based on level 2 risk analysis, as I mentioned earlier. Based on our research findings, we found that it is very late to implement response strategy development after the final rule is out. We found companies spending more and experiencing more disruptions, being reactive in terms of response strategy development. In order to help the companies to be more proactive, we identified 5 sets of key actions for response strategy development. Your company should follow an adaptive process from the beginning, invest in pilot testing solutions early, define guiding principles and key requirements and considerations for individual projects and assets, maintaining a balanced approach in dealing with uncertainty, and finally, involving an experienced and diverse team in devising the response strategy. You can find details and examples about each set of key actions in our guide. But let me give you an example about the key action for investing in pilot testing solutions early. As Ryan mentioned, one company in our maths case study adopted the technologies early and used the data that they generated for communication with the stakeholders. And that helped them with their stakeholder engagement. But that was not the only benefit. The main benefit was that the data helped them to evaluate the effectiveness of different emission reduction technologies early and evaluate what technology would be more suitable for what type of assets. There is no one-size-fits-all solution in terms of compliance implementation for all types of projects and assets. So this information generated by early investment led the company to develop a robust response strategy, and this led them to reduce the cost of compliance later. This is how the value can be realized. If you can relate to the response strategy development from an owner perspective, you probably can relate that from an EPC perspective as well, because this is not just for owners. Let's talk about our business development manager, Joe, who is with a large EPC company. By using the information in our guide about response strategy development, Joe can understand the needs of his clients and how they are dealing and affected by regulatory changes, and help them adopt those pilot testing solutions early, and by doing so, create a business opportunity for his firm. And that's an important consideration for an EPC firm to help clients for response strategy development, and later on, implementation of that. A good response strategy is a foundation of good compliance implementation. What is compliance implementation? It's operationalizing a response strategy in individual assets and projects. Our research identified 3 sets of key actions for effective compliance implementation. First, integrating regulatory adaptation with the capital project development process, or a stage gate process, as all familiar with. Communicating with different stakeholders and functions, and also continuous monitoring. A good example of communicating with different functions and different stakeholders can be found in our case study of Silica Standard and what an EPC firm did for generating information and communicating with different functions and different roles. The company developed extensive communication and training materials. They hosted webinars and workshops. They posted information through internal discussion boards to ensure that every function that is affected by this new role can understand the implications. For example, a project manager like Patty or like Maria could use this information to communicate with engineering, to make sure that they're using an updated compliance matrix, and they can update their basis for design based on the requirements of a new role. And this reduces the non-compliance risk in the implementation of the project. We just gave you a glimpse of the components of our regulatory future-proofing process and the key actions related to each swim lane. Now let's zoom out and look at the process map again.
Thanks, Ali. And thank you all for giving us your attention as we worked our way through this process map. Again, we don't intend that you read this now, but we want you to see it and recognize it and hopefully seek it out. It's available in our guide and through your conference materials. We will also be talking our way through it in the exhibit hall after our presentation. We hope that this process map has given you a flavor of what this can provide for you and for your company. The process map is adaptable and can be changed based on internal structures. Now let's take a step back and think about some high-level cross-cutting themes that we identified in our research. Good practices are for implementation, what we're referring to as the pillars of regulatory future-proofing. And there are 4 that we identified. First is early involvement. As Carzell mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, it's critical to start early. If you're waiting until a final rule has been published, it is too late. Start early and be proactive in your regulatory future-proofing. It's also important to right-size resources. Invest in regulatory adaptation and make sure that those investments match the regulatory challenge. Third, communication is critical across business units and with stakeholders. Laura mentioned that we all have a role to play in regulatory adaptation, which means we all need to be communicating the challenges of regulatory future-proofing. And finally, continuously evaluate and evolve your systems. Ollie mentioned the importance of pilot testing and evaluating, and it's important to do that across the regulatory future-proofing approach. So that concludes our discussion of the process map and our future-proofing pillars. I'll hand it off to my colleagues for some concluding thoughts.
Thanks, Ryan. So as we conclude, all of the information that we share with you today, and even more, is available in the Guide to Regulatory Future-Proofing. Again, the guide has 3 parts. Process map. Process map lays out various steps. It shows information flows, and it shows the key decisions. The key actions should be used to help to effectively carry out the steps. And then we have the overarching factors, and they should be used to help with the success of the overall process. Now, one of the things that we found, or one of the things that we didn't find, is out of all of the companies that we talked to, we did not find one company that had a perfect practice. If we were to plot all of the companies on a spectrum, we would see that there are different places or locations on that spectrum for all of these companies. So that tells us that there's room for improvement for everyone. And we have that improvement in our guide. If this information is brand new to you or your company, then you may want to take the process map to orient yourself and to determine your role, and then read the associated key actions. If you have a lot of experience in one role or one aspect of regulatory changes, then what you may want to do is just look at the key actions, read through it, and see if there's some additional information that you can learn. If you have managerial responsibilities, or if regulations could impact your portfolio, you may want to look at the key actions, the good practices, and the future-proofing pillars, then give the guide to someone on your team. So hopefully this presentation has piqued your interest enough where you reflect on your role. If you have the desire to improve or help your company even more, this guide that we've developed can help you along that journey. This guide, at its core, is an educational tool, an assessment tool, and it's a resource to help implement a more proactive way, a more proactive approach to deal with regulatory changes.
So to wrap up, let's just review one last time the benefits of implementing this future-proofing process that we've developed. First and foremost, it's avoiding surprises. We talked at the very beginning about the disruptive nature that regulatory changes can bring, especially if you're not paying attention, especially if it represents a surprise. But more importantly, we talked about also being the importance of being more proactive. Now, by starting early, even at the early stages of a regulatory process when the uncertainty is the highest, it gains you time to do the analysis that you need to identify what the potential impacts are and gives you the flexibility of considering all of the different options that are at your disposal at that point. And the future-proofing process also, by integrating information across different organizational silos, enables better decision-making. Better decision-making also leads to a better allocation of resources, which means lower cost, and you're implementing the most effective and efficient solution. And also, by starting early and giving yourself that long lead time, you can incorporate that solution into your other plan, along with your other planning processes or other projects that are ongoing at the same time. All of this, again, takes working together across your organization with different functions, getting input, pushing information out, doing the analysis, getting that analysis into the hands of decision makers. And our regulatory future-proofing framework lays out all of those decisions, all of those pieces, and brings it all together. So we appreciate your taking the time to listen to us today. We're happy to answer some questions. I'm going to invite my co-chair, Randy Kulhanek, up to facilitate that Q&A. And just while he's coming up, if we could just go one more slide. We also wanted to thank all of the members of our team. We had a super team, as we like to call it, and had a lot of help, not just from the members of our team, but also a lot of the companies, CII member companies, and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, thanks for the great presentation, and we're out of time. But there are just a couple of questions that we maybe could go through real quickly, and then we will be at the table after this to answer all the other ones we didn't get to. So the first is the guide applicable to the PUI only, or is it applicable to all our industry sectors?
So the short answer is no, it is applicable. We do believe that it's applicable to other industry sectors. We concentrated mainly on the power utility, mostly actually on the power sector, but we also got input from other companies in the oil and gas sector as well, and we're pretty sure that it applies almost universally to any company that has kind of fixed assets that would in some way be impacted by regulatory changes.
All right, and then one more quick one. Are you seeing cybersecurity regulations affecting capital projects, and are they handled with this same model?
Yes, cybersecurity regulations are impacting capital projects in the sense that the underlying cyber infrastructure that supports the operations of that project need to incorporate the requirements of cybersecurity regulations, and those are an incredibly dynamic and fluid and constantly evolving set of requirements. So it does require almost, I won't say more nimbleness than some other types of regulations, but it is a very quickly developing field at this particular point in time, and so it does require an extra set of, or some extra attention to be paid to it.
And I just add to that, the concept of regulated future-proofing was originally initiated in the IT sector, or dealing with cybersecurity regulations. And basically that inspired us to look at regulatory future-proofing for the construction industry, for the type of regulations that we are dealing with. And as Laura mentions, cybersecurity is an emerging one.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all.